The stagecoach carrying Eleanor Abbott into Kearney, Nebraska, in the summer of 1878 kicked up dust that settled on her black morning dress like a second skin, and she pressed one hand against her belly where a secret grew that would change everything. She had left everything behind in St. Louis, fleeing the whispers and the shame, carrying nothing but a small trunk and the weight of her condition. The baby inside her belonged to a man who had promised her the world and delivered only heartbreak before disappearing into the night with her father's money and another woman's name on his lips. Eleanor was 22 years old, 3 months along, and utterly alone in a world that had no patience for women in her circumstances. The town of Kearney sprawled before her like something out of a fever dream. All wooden storefronts and dust-choked streets, cattle lowing in distant pens, and the metallic ring of a blacksmith's hammer carrying on the hot wind. She climbed down from the stage with as much dignity as she could muster, her legs shaking from the journey and from fear. The other passengers gave her curious looks but said nothing. A widow traveling alone was unusual but not unheard of. What they did not know, what she prayed they would never discover, was that her husband had never existed at all. She had taken rooms at a boarding house run by a severe-looking woman named Mrs. Henderson, who accepted Eleanor's story about being recently widowed with a tight-lipped nod and showed her to a small room on the second floor. The room was sparse but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the main street. Eleanor set her trunk down and sat on the bed, feeling the tears she had held back for 3 days of travel finally break free. She wept silently, her shoulders shaking, one hand still pressed protectively over her stomach. She had no plan beyond survival. The money she had managed to save from her work as a seamstress in St. Louis would last perhaps 2 months if she was careful. After that, she would need to find work, and that would become increasingly difficult as her condition became apparent. The shame of it burned in her chest like hot coals. She had been so foolish, so naive, believing Thomas when he said he loved her, when he whispered promises against her skin in the darkness of his rented room. He had seemed so sincere, so genuine with his fine clothes and his talk of the business opportunities waiting out west. She had given him everything, including her virtue, and he had taken it all and vanished like smoke. That first week in Kearney passed in a haze of grief and adjustment. Eleanor kept to herself, venturing out only to purchase necessities and to attend church on Sunday, where she sat in the back pew and avoided the curious gazes of the townspeople. She had begun to establish a routine, to build the careful facade of a respectable widow, when everything changed on a sweltering Thursday afternoon in mid-July. She had been walking back to the boarding house with a basket of mending she had taken on from the general store owner, grateful for any work that would stretch her dwindling funds, when she heard the commotion. Shouting erupted from the saloon across the street, followed by the crash of breaking glass. Eleanor froze, her heart hammering, as 2 men came tumbling out through the saloon doors in a tangle of fists and fury. One of them was a stocky man with a florid face and the elaborate vest of a gambler. The other was taller, lean and rangy, with dark hair and shoulders that spoke of hard physical labor. They grappled in the dust of the street, trading blows while a small crowd gathered to watch. Eleanor knew she should look away, should hurry on to the safety of her room, but something held her rooted to the spot. The taller man landed a solid punch that sent the gambler sprawling. He stood over him, breathing hard, his knuckles split and bleeding. "You cheated," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the street. "I saw you palm that card, Dorsey. I want my money back." The gambler, Dorsey, spat blood into the dust and laughed, a nasty sound. Prove it, Prescott. You have got no proof, just sour grapes because you lost. The man called Prescott took a step forward, his hands clenched into fists, and for a moment Eleanor thought he would strike Dorsey again. But then the sheriff arrived, a heavy-set man with a drooping mustache and a star pinned to his vest. "That is enough," he barked. "Both of you break it up." Prescott stepped back, his jaw tight with anger, but he nodded. "I am done here anyway," he said. He turned and walked away, his boots kicking up little puffs of dust, and that was when his eyes met Eleanor's across the street. The contact lasted only a moment, but it sent a strange jolt through her, like touching a live wire. His eyes were a startling blue-gray, the color of storm clouds, and they held a mixture of anger and something else she could not quite name. Then he looked away and continued walking, heading toward the livery stable at the edge of town. Eleanor hurried back to the boarding house, her cheeks flushed, her heart still racing. She told herself it was the shock of witnessing the fight, but she knew that was not entirely true. There had been something about the cowboy, something in the set of his shoulders and the directness of his gaze, that had reached past all her carefully constructed walls. Over the next few days, she found herself thinking about him more than she should. She learned his name from the gossip that flowed freely through the boarding house. Warren Prescott, a ranch hand who worked for the Circle K spread about 10 miles outside of town. He had a reputation as a hard worker and an honest man, though perhaps a bit too quick with his fists when provoked. He came into town once or twice a week for supplies and the occasional drink, but he kept mostly to himself. Eleanor told herself firmly that it did not matter. She had no business thinking about any man, especially not in her condition. She needed to focus on survival, on building a life for herself and her child. Romance was a luxury she could not afford, and besides, what man would want a woman carrying another man's baby? But fate, it seemed, had other plans. It was a Sunday afternoon, 2 weeks after her arrival in Kearney, when their paths crossed again. Eleanor had been feeling restless, confined by the small room and the weight of her secrets, and she had decided to take a walk along the creek that ran just outside of town. The day was hot but bearable in the shade of the cottonwood trees that lined the water, and she found a flat rock where she could sit and watch the current flow past. She had been there perhaps 20 minutes, lost in thought, when she heard the sound of hoofbeats. She looked up to see a rider approaching along the creek bank, and her heart gave a small, treacherous leap when she recognized Warren Prescott astride a rangy bay horse. He saw her at the same moment and reined in his mount, his expression shifting from surprise to something more guarded. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the sun-dappled space. Then Warren touched the brim of his hat in a polite gesture. "Afternoon, madam. I did not mean to disturb you." "You are not disturbing me," Eleanor said, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. "It is a lovely day for a ride." He dismounted with an easy grace that spoke of years in the saddle and led his horse to the water to drink. Eleanor knew she should make her excuses and leave, should maintain the proper distance between a widow in mourning and a single man, but she found herself unable to move. There was something compelling about him, something that drew her like a moth to flame despite all her resolutions. Warren stood by his horse, one hand resting on the animal's neck, and seemed to be debating with himself. Finally, he spoke again. "I saw you in town a couple weeks back, during that unfortunate incident with Dorsey." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Yes." "I am sorry you had to deal with such a dishonest man." A faint smile crossed Warren's face, softening the hard lines of his features. "Part of life, I suppose. There are men in this world who will cheat you if you let them. The key is not letting them." He paused, then added, "I am Warren Prescott." "Eleanor Abbott," she replied, then added the lie that had become so familiar, Mrs. Abbott. Something flickered in Warren's eyes at the title, but he simply nodded. Pleased to make your acquaintance, Mrs. Abbott. You are new to Kearney. I arrived a few weeks ago from St. Louis. I am recently widowed and decided a fresh start might be beneficial. The words came easily now, practiced and smooth, but they left a bitter taste in her mouth. Warren's expression gentled with sympathy. I am sorry for your loss. That must be difficult. Guilt stabbed through Eleanor like a knife. She hated lying to him, hated the deception, but what choice did she have? The truth would destroy any chance she had at building a respectable life here. Thank you, she managed. It has been an adjustment. They talked for a while longer about inconsequential things. The weather, the town, the differences between Nebraska and Missouri. Warren had an easy way about him, a quiet confidence that put her at ease despite her nerves. He did not pry or ask uncomfortable questions, but listened when she spoke and offered observations that showed he was genuinely interested in what she had to say. It was so different from Thomas, who had always dominated every conversation, always steering things back to himself and his grand plans. When Eleanor finally said she should be getting back to town, Warren offered to escort her. It is not proper for a lady to walk alone, he said simply. I will lead my horse and walk with you if you do not mind the company. She should have declined. Every rule of propriety said she should have thanked him politely and gone on her way alone. But the truth was, she did not want to be alone. She was tired of being alone, tired of carrying her burden in silence. So she accepted, and they walked back to Kearney together in the golden afternoon light, talking about everything and nothing. That walk became the first of many encounters over the following weeks. It seemed that every time Eleanor ventured out, she somehow ran into Warren Prescott. He would tip his hat and stop to talk, always respectful, always appropriate, but with a warmth in his eyes that made her heart beat faster. She learned that he was 26 years old, that he had come west from Ohio after his parents died, that he had worked his way up from stable hand to one of the most trusted men on the Circle K ranch. He had dreams of owning his own land someday, of building something that would last. And Eleanor found herself falling, slowly but inexorably, despite every warning her mind screamed at her. She fell for the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, for the gentle way he handled his horse, for the quiet strength in his voice when he spoke about the things he believed in. She fell for the fact that he treated her like a person, not just a widow to be pitied or a woman to be conquered. But as the weeks turned into months and summer began to fade toward autumn, Eleanor's secret became harder to hide. Her dresses were growing tight around the middle, and she had to let out seams and add panels to disguise the growing swell of her belly. She was 4 months along now, then 5, and she knew that soon no amount of careful dressing would conceal her condition. The guilt of her deception grew heavier with each passing day. Warren had become a true friend, perhaps the best friend she had ever had, and she was lying to him with every breath. She knew she should tell him the truth, should end their friendship before it went any further, but she was terrified. Terrified of losing him, of seeing the warmth in his eyes turn to disgust, of being cast out of the fragile life she had built. It was a crisp October afternoon when everything came crashing down. Eleanor had been walking back from the general store when a wave of dizziness overtook her. She stumbled, dropping her packages, and would have fallen if strong hands had not caught her. She looked up into Warren's concerned face, and for a moment all she could do was cling to him while the world spun. "Eleanor," he said urgently, and it was the first time he had used her given name without the title attached. "Eleanor, are you all right? You are white as a sheet." "I am fine," she managed, though she clearly was not. Just a momentary weakness, the heat, but it was not hot. The day was cool and pleasant, and Warren's expression told her he was not fooled. "Let me help you back to the boarding house," he said firmly. "You should lie down." She did not have the strength to argue. She let him gather her packages and guide her down the street, his arm supporting her weight. Mrs. Henderson met them at the door with pursed lips and disapproving eyes, but she said nothing as Warren helped Eleanor up the stairs to her room. Once inside, Eleanor sank onto the bed, and that was when she saw Warren's eyes travel down her form and widen with realization. The shawl she had been wearing to disguise her shape had fallen away, and there was no hiding the clear swell of her belly beneath her dress. The silence that fell between them was deafening. Eleanor watched as understanding dawned in Warren's eyes, followed by confusion. His gaze moved from her stomach to her face and back again, and she could see him working through the arithmetic, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "Eleanor," he said slowly, carefully, "are you with child?" There was no point in lying anymore. The truth was written plainly on her body for anyone to see. Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. Warren stood very still, his hat in his hands, his expression unreadable. "How far along?" "Nearly 6 months now." She watched him calculate the dates in his head, saw the moment he realized that she would have already been pregnant when she arrived in Kearney, when she first introduced herself as a widow. The look on his face nearly broke her heart. "Your husband," he said quietly. "The one you said died." Eleanor could not meet his eyes. The tears were flowing freely now, hot tracks down her cheeks. "There was no husband," she confessed, her voice breaking. "I was never married. I lied to you, Warren. I lied to everyone." The confession hung in the air between them like smoke. Eleanor waited for the condemnation, for the anger and disgust she knew she deserved. But when Warren spoke again, his voice was not harsh. It was gentle, almost unbearably so. "Tell me what happened," he said, and so she did. Sitting on that narrow bed in her rented room, Eleanor Abbott told Warren Prescott the whole sorry tale. She told him about Thomas, about the promises and the lies, about how she had believed herself loved only to discover she had been nothing more than a convenient distraction. She told him about the shame and the fear, about fleeing St. Louis with what little money she had saved, about creating the fiction of the dead husband, because she could not bear the thought of her child being branded a bastard before it was even born. Warren listened without interrupting, his face grave, his eyes never leaving hers. When she finally fell silent, wrung out and exhausted by the confession, he was quiet for a long moment. "I am carrying another man's baby," Eleanor said, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I understand if you want nothing more to do with me. I know I have lied to you, deceived you. I am sorry, Warren. I am so very sorry." Warren looked at her for what felt like an eternity. She could see thoughts moving behind his eyes, emotions flickering across his face too quickly to name. Then slowly, deliberately, he crossed the room and knelt beside the bed so that they were at eye level. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion. "Do you remember the first real conversation we had, down by the creek when we talked about fresh starts?" She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "I came west looking for a fresh start myself," Warren continued. "Not because I had done anything wrong, but because I needed to leave the past behind and build something new. I understand that need, Eleanor. I understand it better than you might think." "But I lied to you," she protested weakly. "You did what you had to do to survive," Warren said firmly. "You protected yourself and your child the only way you knew how. I cannot fault you for that." Eleanor stared at him through her tears, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "You do not despise me." Warren reached out and took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. I could never despise you, Eleanor. You are one of the bravest women I have ever met." "I am not brave," she whispered. "I am terrified. Brave is not the same as fearless," Warren said. "Brave means being afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway. You have done that every day since you arrived in Kearney. That takes courage." Fresh tears spilled down Eleanor's cheeks, but these were different from before. These were tears of relief, of hope, of something she barely dared to name. "What do I do now?" she asked. "Everyone will know soon. Mrs. Henderson is already suspicious. Once the truth comes out, I will be ruined. They will drive me out of town." Warren was quiet for a moment, his thumb moving absently across her knuckles. Then he looked up at her, and there was something blazing in his eyes that made her breath catch. "Marry me," he said. Eleanor's heart stopped. "What? Marry me?" Warren repeated, his voice steady and sure. "We will say the baby is mine, that we were married quietly. No one needs to know the truth except us. Warren, you cannot be serious. You cannot sacrifice yourself like that. You do not owe me anything." "This is not about owing you anything," Warren said intensely. "Eleanor, I have been falling in love with you since that first day by the creek. Maybe since that moment in the street when our eyes met and I felt something shift in my chest. I know it is fast. I know it is unconventional, but out here we make our own rules. I want to marry you. I want to be a father to your child. I want to build a life with you." Eleanor felt as though she could not breathe. "You would do that? You would take on another man's child as your own?" Warren smiled then, a smile so full of warmth and love that it seemed to light up the dim room. "Then I will love two hearts, not one," he said softly. "Yours and the baby's. That seems like a blessing, not a burden." Something broke open in Eleanor's chest, some dam she had built around her heart to protect herself from more pain. Love flooded through her, overwhelming and terrifying and beautiful all at once. "I do not deserve you," she whispered. "That is not for you to decide," Warren said. He stood and drew her gently to her feet, his hands on her arms, his eyes searching her face. "Eleanor Abbott, will you marry me? Will you let me love you and care for you and be the father your child deserves?" Eleanor looked into his eyes and saw nothing but sincerity, nothing but love. She thought about everything she had been through, all the pain and fear and shame, and she realized that somehow, impossibly, she had been given a second chance, not just to survive but to truly live, to love and be loved in return. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking on the word. "Yes, Warren, I will marry you." He pulled her into his arms then, careful of her belly, and held her while she cried. They were good tears this time, tears of relief and joy and gratitude. When she finally pulled back, Warren used his thumbs to gently wipe the moisture from her cheeks. "We should do it soon," he said practically. "Before anyone starts counting months too carefully. Can you be ready by the end of the week?" Eleanor laughed, a slightly hysterical sound. "I have nothing to prepare. No dress, no family, no celebration, just me." "Just you is everything I need," Warren said simply. They were married 4 days later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Kearney. The preacher asked no questions, perhaps because Warren was well respected in the community, perhaps because he simply did not care to know the details. Mrs. Henderson attended as witness, her expression still disapproving but slightly mollified by the fact that respectability had been salvaged. Eleanor wore her best dress, the blue one that had always been her favorite, with a white shawl to ward off the autumn chill. Warren wore a new shirt and had clearly made an effort to tame his dark hair, though by the time the ceremony was over, it had already begun to fall back into its usual slightly wild state. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife and Warren kissed her for the first time, Eleanor felt something settle in her chest, some piece that had been missing clicking into place. This was what love was supposed to feel like, she realized. Not the desperate, anxious thing she had felt with Thomas, always wondering if he really meant his promises, always trying to be what he wanted. This was steady and strong and real, something she could build a life on. After the ceremony, Warren took her to the ranch. He had spoken to his employer, a gruff but fair man named Killian, and secured a small cabin on the edge of the property for them to live in. It was not much, just 2 rooms and a fireplace, but to Eleanor it looked like a palace. It was hers, truly hers, and more importantly, it was theirs. That first night as man and wife, they sat together by the fireplace and talked for hours. Warren wanted to know everything about her. Her childhood in St. Louis, her work as a seamstress, her favorite books and foods and dreams for the future. And he shared his own stories in return, tales of growing up in Ohio, of the journey west after his parents succumbed to fever, of learning the cattle business from the ground up. When Eleanor grew tired, Warren insisted she take the bed while he made up a pallet by the fire. "We will take this as slowly as you need," he said gently. "I meant what I said about loving you, Eleanor, but I do not expect anything from you that you are not ready to give. We have time." Eleanor felt her throat tighten with emotion. "You are unlike any man I have ever known," she said softly. Warren smiled at her from his spot by the fire, his face shadowed and warm in the flickering light. "I am just a man who knows a good thing when he sees it," he said. "Now get some rest. Tomorrow is the start of our life together." Eleanor lay in the bed, one hand resting on her belly where the baby kicked and rolled, and felt peace for the first time in months. She was married to a good man. She had a home, and her child would be born with a father who had already vowed to love it. The past could not be changed, but the future was suddenly bright with possibility. The weeks that followed were some of the happiest of Eleanor's life. Warren was true to his word about taking things slowly, treating her with a gentle respect that made her fall more in love with him every day. He left early each morning to work on the ranch, but he always returned in the evening with some small gift. Wildflowers he had picked, a ribbon he had bought in town, once a book of poetry he thought she might enjoy. They fell into an easy domesticity that felt natural despite how new it all was. Eleanor cooked and mended and kept their little cabin tidy, though Warren insisted she not overexert herself given her condition. In the evenings, they would sit together and talk, or Warren would read to her while she worked on sewing baby clothes from scraps of fabric. The baby seemed to respond to Warren's presence. Whenever he put his hand on Eleanor's belly, the child would kick as though in greeting, and Warren's face would light up with wonder. "Strong one," he would say with pride, as though the baby truly were his own flesh and blood. As autumn deepened into winter, Eleanor's belly grew large and round. She could no longer hide her condition, but with Warren's ring on her finger and his name attached to hers, she faced the world without shame. The women of Kearney accepted her as Mrs. Prescott, and if anyone questioned the timing of the pregnancy, they kept their suspicions to themselves. Out here in the West, people understood that sometimes you did not ask too many questions about a person's past. The baby came on a cold January night in 1879, arriving 3 weeks earlier than Eleanor had calculated. The labor was long and difficult, attended by a midwife from town and Warren, who refused to leave despite the midwife's scandalized protests that birth was no place for a man. "That is my wife and my child," Warren said firmly. "I am staying." Eleanor clung to his hand through the waves of pain, drawing strength from his presence. When the baby finally arrived with a lusty cry in the gray light of dawn, Warren was the first to hold the child after the midwife had cleaned it. "A boy," he said, his voice choked with emotion. He looked down at the squalling infant with such love on his face that Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes. "You have a son, Eleanor." She held out her arms and Warren carefully placed the baby against her chest. The infant was red-faced and wrinkled, with a shock of dark hair and tiny fists that waved in the air. Eleanor felt a surge of love so powerful it was almost painful. This was her son, her child, and he was perfect. "What should we name him?" Warren asked softly, sitting on the edge of the bed. Eleanor looked up at her husband, this man who had given her everything, who had accepted another man's child as his own without hesitation. "I want to name him after you," she said. "Warren Jr." Warren's eyes grew bright with unshed tears. "Are you certain?" "He does not have to carry my name if you would rather." "He is your son," Eleanor said firmly. "In every way that matters, Warren, he is yours, and I want him to have your name." So Warren Jr. Prescott was entered into the family Bible. And if anyone in Kearney found the timing of his birth suspicious, no one said so to their faces. Warren took to fatherhood like he had been born to it. He would walk the floor with the baby in the middle of the night when he cried, freeing Eleanor to rest. He would talk to the infant in a low, soothing voice while Eleanor cooked dinner, telling the baby about the ranch and the horses and the big, wide world he would grow up in. As winter gave way to spring and baby Warren grew from a newborn into a thriving infant, Eleanor found herself falling more deeply in love with her husband every day. The gratitude she had initially felt had transformed into something richer and more complex. She loved the way Warren's face softened when he looked at their son. She loved his quiet strength and his gentle humor. She loved the way he made her feel safe and cherished, as though she were the most precious thing in his world. One night in early spring, after they had put the baby to bed in his cradle, Eleanor and Warren sat together on the porch of their cabin, watching the stars come out. The air was soft and smelled of new grass and possibility. "Warren," Eleanor said quietly, "I need to tell you something." He looked at her with immediate concern. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I am more than all right," she said, reaching for his hand. "I just wanted you to know that I love you, not because you married me or because you have been good to the baby. I love you because of who you are. Because you are kind and honest and true. Because you make me want to be a better person. Because when I look at you, I see my future and it is beautiful." Warren's expression transformed with joy. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. "Eleanor, I have loved you since that first day by the creek. Maybe before. Maybe from the moment I saw you standing in the street and something in my soul recognized something in yours. You are my heart, do you understand? You and that baby in there, you are everything to me." When he kissed her, it was different from the chaste kisses they had shared before. This was deeper, more passionate, full of promise and desire. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Eleanor rested her forehead against his. "Take me to bed," she whispered. "Truly. I am your wife, Warren, and I want to be your wife in every way." Warren's eyes darkened with want, but he hesitated. "Are you certain? I do not want you to feel you owe me anything." "This is not about owing you," Eleanor said, echoing his words from that long-ago day in her boarding house room. "This is about loving you. This is about choosing you, choosing us, choosing this life we are building together." Warren stood and swept her into his arms, carrying her inside to their bed. That night, they consummated their marriage in truth, and Eleanor finally understood what it meant to be truly loved, body and soul. This was nothing like her fumbling encounters with Thomas had been. This was tender and passionate and mutual. Two people joining together not just physically but emotionally, spiritually. Afterwards, lying in Warren's arms with her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, Eleanor felt completely at peace. The past was behind her, forgiven if not forgotten. The future stretched ahead full of promise. The years that followed were good ones. Warren worked hard and saved carefully, and 3 years after they were married, he had enough to buy a small parcel of land of his own. It was not much, just 100 acres with a creek running through it and decent grazing, but it was theirs. They built a house, larger than the cabin, with 3 bedrooms and a real kitchen. Warren started his own small herd of cattle, building his dream 1 cow at a time. Young Warren, whom they called Junior to distinguish him from his father, grew into a bright, curious boy. He had his mother's dark hair and delicate features, but he had his father's steady temperament and love of the outdoors. When he was 4 years old, Eleanor gave birth to a second son, whom they named Daniel. 2 years after that came a daughter, Grace, with her father's gray-blue eyes and her mother's smile. Warren never treated Junior any differently than he treated the younger children. If anything, he seemed to have a special bond with his eldest son, the boy he had chosen to love before he was even born. He taught Junior to ride and rope, to read the weather and the land, to be honest and kind and strong. Sometimes in the quiet moments, Eleanor would think about Thomas, about the man who had fathered her first child but had never been a father to him. She felt pity for him, for what he had missed. Junior was an incredible boy, smart and funny and loving, and Thomas would never know him. That was his loss. She also thought sometimes about what might have happened if Warren had not been in that street that day, if their eyes had not met across the dust and the distance. She might have ended up alone and destitute, her child taken from her, her life destroyed by the unforgiving standards of society. Or she might have found some other way to survive, harder and lonelier. But she had been lucky enough to find Warren, and he had been strong enough to love her despite everything. One evening, when Junior was 8 years old, he came to Eleanor with a question that made her heart clench. They were sitting on the porch together, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold, and Junior said, "Mama, Billy Tanner at school said his pa told him I do not look like Pa. He said I must not really be Pa's son." Eleanor felt her blood run cold. This was the conversation she had always dreaded, had known would come someday but had hoped to postpone indefinitely. "What did you say to Billy?" she asked carefully. "I said he was a liar and I punched him in the nose," Junior said matter-of-factly. "Then Miss Peterson made me sit in the corner for fighting." Despite the seriousness of the situation, Eleanor felt a flicker of inappropriate pride. "You should not have hit him," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, "but I understand why you did. So it is not true, right?" Junior looked up at her with Warren's steady gaze, even though his eyes were brown, not blue. "I am Pa's son." Eleanor took a deep breath. She and Warren had discussed this moment many times, had debated how much to tell Junior and when. They had ultimately decided that honesty, delivered with love, was the best policy. But faced with her son's earnest face, Eleanor found her carefully prepared words deserting her. Fortunately, Warren chose that moment to come around the corner of the house, having just finished the evening chores. He took one look at Eleanor's face and Junior's tense posture, and immediately understood that something significant was happening. "Junior," he said, sitting down on the other side of the boy, "it sounds like we need to have a talk." Between them, carefully and gently, Eleanor and Warren told Junior the truth. They told him about Thomas, about the circumstances of his conception, about how Eleanor had been alone and afraid when she came to Kearney. They told him about the day Warren had discovered the truth and had chosen love over judgment. Junior listened in silence, his young face serious, processing this information that fundamentally changed his understanding of his own identity. When they finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "So my real father is some man named Thomas who ran away," he finally said. "Thomas is the man who helped create you," Warren said carefully. "But he was never a father to you. I am your father, Junior. I have been your father since before you were born. I chose you and I choose you every single day. Nothing can change that." Junior looked between his mother and Warren, and Eleanor saw tears gathering in his eyes. "Do you wish I was not here?" he asked, his voice small. "Do you wish Mama had not had me?" "Oh, sweetheart, no." Eleanor pulled him into her arms, holding him tight. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me. Yes, the circumstances were difficult, but I would go through it all again in a heartbeat to have you. And I would choose you and your mother every single time," Warren added, his hand resting on Junior's shoulder. "You are my son. You are a Prescott. That will never change." Junior cried then, and they held him between them, this boy who was growing too fast, who was no longer a baby but not quite old enough to bear the weight of such knowledge without pain. But children were resilient, Eleanor knew, and Junior was especially strong. When his tears finally subsided, he looked up at Warren with red-rimmed eyes. "I am glad you are my pa," he said simply. Warren's own eyes were suspiciously bright. "I am glad I am your pa too, son." They decided together that they would not hide the truth from the other children when they were old enough to understand. Secrets had a way of festering and causing pain. Better to live openly, with love as their foundation. The town of Kearney could think what it liked. They were a family, bound not just by blood but by choice and commitment. As Junior grew older, he came to understand and appreciate the full weight of what Warren had done, the sacrifice and the love that had gone into claiming another man's child as his own. It deepened the bond between father and son, making it stronger rather than weaker. The years rolled on, marked by hard work and simple joys. The Prescott Ranch grew slowly but steadily. They would never be wealthy, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were happy. Eleanor's skill with a needle brought in extra money, and she took on sewing projects for the ladies of Kearney. Warren's reputation as an honest dealer meant his cattle always fetched fair prices. They weathered droughts and hard winters, sickness and setbacks. When Eleanor miscarried a fourth child, Warren held her through her grief and reminded her of the 3 beautiful children they had been blessed with. When a particularly brutal winter killed a quarter of their herd, Eleanor reminded Warren of how far they had come and how much they still had. Through it all, their love remained the bedrock of their family. Eleanor would sometimes watch Warren playing with the children or working on some project around the ranch, and she would marvel at how lucky she had been. Out of her darkest moment had come this beautiful life, this good man, this family she had never dared to hope for. When Junior was 16, he started courting a girl from a neighboring ranch, a sweet-faced blonde named Lizzie who made him blush and stammer. Warren teased him mercilessly but with affection, while Eleanor fretted that her eldest was growing up too fast. Daniel showed an aptitude for numbers and talked about becoming a banker someday. Grace was all tomboy, more interested in helping her father with the cattle than learning to cook and sew, much to Eleanor's exasperated amusement. They were a normal family, with all the joys and frustrations and complications that entailed. The fact that Junior had been born before Warren and Eleanor married was simply part of their story, not a shameful secret, but a testament to the power of love and choice. One summer evening, when Junior was 17, he came to Warren with a serious expression. Warren was fixing a fence post, and he looked up with a smile when he saw his son approaching. "What is on your mind, son?" "I have been thinking," Junior said, "about names, about legacy." Warren set down his hammer and gave Junior his full attention. "What about them?" "Daniel is going to be a banker, and he will carry on the Prescott name in town. And Grace is going to marry someday, and she will take her husband's name. But I am going to stay on the land, Pa. I am going to be a rancher like you, and I want my children to know the full story of their grandfather." Warren's expression softened. "Junior, you do not have to prove anything to me. You know that, right? You are my son in every way that matters." "I know that," Junior said firmly. "But I also want my children to know that they come from a man who was brave enough to love someone else's child as his own. I want them to know the story of how their grandmother came to Kearney alone and afraid, and how their grandfather chose compassion over judgment. That is a legacy worth preserving." Warren pulled his son into a rough hug, his eyes bright with emotion. "You are going to be a fine man, Junior. You already are." Eleanor, watching from the porch with Grace clinging to her skirts, felt tears slide down her cheeks. Her baby was nearly grown, her family was thriving, and the shame and fear of those early days in Kearney felt like a distant dream. She had been given a second chance at life, and she had seized it with both hands. That night, lying in bed with Warren's arm around her, Eleanor said softly, "Do you remember that day in my room at the boarding house? When I told you the truth about the baby, how could I forget?" Warren said, his voice rumbling in his chest beneath her ear. "You said you would love two hearts instead of one, that it was a blessing, not a burden." "I meant every word." "It has been more than a blessing," Eleanor said, tilting her head to look up at him. "It has been everything. You gave me a life, Warren. You gave our son a father. You gave me love when I thought I would never deserve it again. How do I possibly thank you for that?" Warren cupped her face in his hand, his thumb stroking her cheek. "You thank me by being exactly who you are, by loving me, by building this life with me. Eleanor, you saved me just as much as I saved you. I was drifting before you, working and surviving but not really living. You gave me purpose. You gave me a family. You gave me everything I never knew I wanted." They kissed then, soft and sweet, a kiss that spoke of shared history and enduring love. They had been married for nearly 18 years, and Eleanor still felt her heart skip when Warren looked at her a certain way. That, she thought, was the real miracle. Not just that he had accepted her and Junior, but that they had built something lasting and true. As the years continued to pass, the Prescott family became a fixture in Kearney and the surrounding area. Junior married his Lizzie and started a family of his own on a piece of land adjoining Warren's ranch. Daniel did indeed become a banker, moving to Omaha but visiting frequently with his wife and children. Grace surprised everyone by marrying a schoolteacher and becoming a teacher herself, bringing education to the children of ranching families scattered across the Nebraska plains. Warren and Eleanor grew older together, their hair turning gray, their faces lined by years of prairie sun and wind. But Warren's eyes still lit up when Eleanor entered a room, and Eleanor's heart still fluttered when Warren took her hand. The passion of youth had mellowed into something deeper and richer, a love that had weathered storms and emerged stronger. They became grandparents, and then great-grandparents, their family tree spreading and branching in ways Eleanor could never have imagined during those dark days in St. Louis. And they made sure that every child in the family knew the story of how Warren Prescott had chosen to love a child who was not his blood, and how that choice had created a legacy of love that would endure for generations. On their 30th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered at the main ranch house for a celebration. Junior, now a man of 33 with 3 children of his own, stood to make a toast. "To my parents," he said, his voice carrying across the crowded room. "To the woman who was brave enough to come west alone, and to the man who was brave enough to love without conditions. You taught us what family really means. You taught us that love is a choice, and that we should choose it every single day. Thank you for choosing each other. Thank you for choosing all of us." There was not a dry eye in the room as everyone raised their glasses. Warren pulled Eleanor close and kissed her temple, and she leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of him against her side. "No regrets," she whispered. "Not a single one," Warren whispered back. "Not one," Eleanor confirmed. "How could I regret the path that led me to you?" That night, after the guests had left and the house was quiet, Warren and Eleanor sat on the porch of the house they had built together all those years ago. The Nebraska sky stretched overhead, vast and star-studded, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of hay and cattle and home. "You remember what you said that day in my boarding house room?" Eleanor asked. "When I told you I was carrying another man's baby." Warren smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. "I said I would love two hearts instead of one." "And have you?" Eleanor asked. "Has it been worth it?" Warren took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over 3 decades together. "Eleanor, my love, loving you and our children has been the greatest privilege of my life. That boy who came into this world under difficult circumstances grew into a man I am proud to call my son. And the children we made together are just as precious. But it all started with a choice, with deciding that love was more important than convention, that compassion mattered more than judgment. I was so scared that day," Eleanor admitted. "I thought you would turn away from me in disgust." "I could never have done that," Warren said simply. "From the moment I met you, Eleanor, I knew you were special. Finding out about the baby did not change that. If anything, it made me love you more because I could see your strength, your determination to do right by your child no matter what it cost you." Eleanor leaned her head on Warren's shoulder, feeling the peace that had eluded her for so much of her early life. "I love you," she said. "I have loved you for 30 years, and I will love you for 30 more if God grants us the time." "And I love you," Warren replied. "Always have, always will." They sat together in comfortable silence as the stars wheeled overhead. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from the ashes of Eleanor's past. Around them, the ranch they had built together settled into sleep. The cattle lowing softly in their pens, the horses shifting in the barn, the distant sound of coyotes singing to the moon. This was their legacy, Eleanor thought. Not just the land or the house or even the children and grandchildren. Their legacy was the proof that love could overcome anything, that mercy and compassion were stronger than judgment, that a family could be built on choice as much as on blood. The wind shifted, bringing cooler air from the north, and Warren stood to help Eleanor to her feet. "Time for bed," he said gently. "We have church in the morning." They walked into the house together, hand in hand, moving through rooms filled with memories and love. In the bedroom they had shared for 30 years, Warren helped Eleanor with the buttons on her dress, his fingers gentle and familiar. She helped him out of his boots, a nightly ritual that spoke of intimacy and partnership. When they finally lay down together, Eleanor in the curve of Warren's arm, she felt that same sense of safety and belonging that she had felt on their wedding night all those years ago. The past was long behind them, forgiven and transformed into something beautiful. The future was uncertain, as futures always were, but she faced it without fear because she faced it with Warren by her side. "Good night, my love," Warren murmured into her hair. "Good night," Eleanor replied, already drifting toward sleep. And in that moment, in that room, in that house they had built together on the Nebraska plains, Eleanor Abbott Prescott knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. She had traveled a long road from that scared young woman on the stagecoach, carrying a secret that she thought would destroy her. She had found love and acceptance, had built a family and a life beyond her wildest dreams. All because one cowboy had looked at her, had seen past her shame and fear, and had chosen to love not just her, but the child she carried. Had chosen to love two hearts instead of one. And that choice, made on a fall afternoon in a boarding house room in Kearney, Nebraska, had changed everything. The years continued their steady march as years do, but the love between Warren and Eleanor never diminished. If anything, it deepened with time, becoming more essential, more profound. They worked side by side, growing old together with grace and gratitude. When Warren passed away at the age of 78, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, his hand clasped in Eleanor's, his last words were, "I would do it all again. Every moment with you was a gift." Eleanor lived another 5 years without him, and though she missed him every single day, she did not grieve as one without hope. She had been loved deeply and truly. She had built a family that would endure. And when her own time came, she went peacefully in her sleep, a smile on her lips, knowing she would see her cowboy again. At her funeral, Junior stood once more to speak. He was an old man himself now, with grandchildren of his own, but his voice was strong and clear as he told the story of how his parents had met, how his father had chosen to love him before he was even born, how their love had created a legacy that would continue for generations. "My mother came to Nebraska carrying me and carrying shame," he said. "She met a man who looked past the circumstances to see the person she was and the person she could become. And together, they built something extraordinary. They taught us that family is not just about blood. It is about love and commitment and choice. It is about showing up every day and choosing each other, over and over again." He looked at the faces of his children and grandchildren, at the extended family that had grown from that one brave choice Warren Prescott had made so many years ago. "This is their legacy," he continued. "All of us. We are the proof that love wins, that mercy matters, that one act of kindness can change the world." And it was true. From that one moment of grace, from Warren's decision to love Eleanor and the child she carried, had sprung an entire family tree, dozens of lives that would never have existed otherwise. The Prescott name became synonymous in that part of Nebraska with integrity and compassion, with fairness and hard work. Junior's grandchildren would tell the story to their own children, keeping alive the memory of the cowboy who chose love over judgment and the woman who was brave enough to accept his offer. It became a family legend, a touchstone, a reminder of what truly mattered. And somewhere, beyond the veil of this world, Eleanor and Warren were together again, young and whole and full of joy. They walked hand in hand through fields of wildflowers under endless skies, their love eternal, their story complete, because in the end that was what mattered. Not the difficult beginning, not the struggles or the hardships or the judgment of others. What mattered was that they had found each other, had chosen each other, and had built a life together based on love. Warren had loved two hearts instead of one, and those two hearts had created dozens more, a family bound together by blood and choice, by history and hope. And that was the greatest legacy anyone could leave behind, Eleanor thought as she walked beside her cowboy through eternity. Not wealth or fame or power, but love. Always love, enduring and true, passed down through the generations like a precious inheritance. The story of Eleanor and Warren Prescott lived on in the hearts of their descendants, a testament to the transforming power of love, to the courage it takes to start over, to the grace of second chances. And every time someone in the family faced a difficult choice, every time they had to decide between judgment and mercy, between fear and love, they remembered the story of their ancestors and chose love. because that was the lesson Eleanor and Warren had taught them all. That love was always worth it. That loving two hearts instead of one was not a burden but a blessing. That family was not defined by how it began, but by how it continued day after day, year after year, generation after generation. And so the story ended not with Eleanor's death or even with Warren's, but with the living continuation of their love in the lives they had touched, the family they had created, the legacy they had built from dust and faith, and one brave choice on a Nebraska afternoon. Their love story was complete, full and rich and beautiful, a testament to everything good and true in the human heart. And it would echo through time, inspiring their descendants to choose love, always love, no matter the circumstances or the cost. Because in the end, love was the only thing that mattered. Love was the only thing that lasted, and Warren and Eleanor Prescott had proven that beyond all doubt.